commanded by Captain Edward J. Smith. The RMS Olympic arrived in New York for the first time on July 3, 1911, sparking interest and enthusiasm in the local media. On his last day in New York, Captain Edward John Smith apparently had dinner with Mr. and Mrs. W.P. Willey of Flushing, Long Island. After that, he would leave for Europe to take command of the Titanic. At that dinner, Captain Smith according to Mr. Willey, was excited about the prospects of his new command. He said he shared the vessel's designers the utmost confidence in its sailing abilities, and told Mr. and to Mrs. Willey that it was impossible for her to sink. He looked forward to the most successful days of his maritime career and especially insisted that the appearance of the Titanic in the Atlantic would mark a high point of safety and comfort in the evolution of ocean travel. In his report, Merwill described,
Em seu relato, a senhora Wiley descreveu:
From what I know of Captain Smith, he would be the last man to leave the ship if she was sinking.
Herbert Haddock was supposed to captain the Titanic on the ship's maiden voyage. Haddock is best known as the first captain of the Titanic. However, his short 6-day tenure aboard the Titanic would not be taken as worthy. He was a much admired and capable captain in his own right, joining the White Star Line in 1888 as a fourth officer. He quickly rose through the ranks, rising to chief officer within 4 years. He was a logical choice to follow Edward Smith as the new captain of Olympic, allowing Smith to command Titanic's maiden voyage. Ships of this size were new to the world, and controlling them would be a real challenge. Leaving Olympic in Southampton, Smith joined Titanic on the 1st of April in Belfast for her sea trials, which were cut short due to bad weather. He had dismissed Titanic's first master, Captain Herbert Haddock, who had returned to Southampton to take command of Olympic, trading places with Smith. On April 4, 1912, the Titanic arrived in Southampton and docked at Pier 44, according to the paperwork. E.J. Smith signs 59 years old, although he was actually 62 at the time. Interestingly, he correctly gave the age of 61 when he was in command of the Olympic in 1911. A few days before sailing day, there was a surprising announcement. Captain Smith, working under orders from the White Star Line, rearranged the Titanic's crew positions, reappointing Henry Tingle Wilde as chief officer, same rank when aboard the Olympic. This meant that Murdoch was demoted to first officer, and Charles Herbert Lidler to second officer, while David Blair was left out and the other officers remained in the same positions. The decision was not necessarily Smith's, and Lidler later reported.
White Star Line thought it would be a good plan to send Olympic's chief officer just for one voyage. As Titanic's chief officer, the sister ship's experience could help with navigation.
The evidence suggests that the demotion was mainly due to Wilde's use by the White Star Line, who were waiting for their own promotion to captain of a White Star ship. In Lidler's Christian Science Sentinel article, December 1912, this is referenced when he writes,
Shortly before we sailed from Southampton, Wilde, who was formerly chief of the Olympic, should have been given command of another White Star ship, but owing to the coal strike and other reasons, he was sent for the time being to the Titanic as chief, Murdoch taking first place, me second.
In any case, the new chief officer, Henry Tingle Wilde, arrived aboard the ship sometime on the 9th of April, after coal loading, crew recruitment, cargo loading and supplies had taken place. Being assigned to the Titanic was apparently a disappointment for Wilde. It has long been speculated that Wilde would be promoted to captain a White Star ship, possibly the Cymric. Wilde himself wrote on March 31, 1912 to his sister-in-law Annie.
I am very disappointed to find that all preparations for taking over the Cymric have been abandoned due to this coal stoppage and the cancellation of so many ships and crossings. I will now join the Titanic for a while until some other ship comes along for me.
He also mentions the high cost of coal.
We are paying £2 per ton of coal for this ship, and the Titanic a high price when we burn 900 tons a day.
Wilde discovers at 2 p.m. on April 9, 1912 that he is indeed the commander aboard the Titanic. He wrote to his children's nanny in a letter dated the 9th of April 1912.
Just a few lines to let you know I'm sailing the Titanic tomorrow for some voyages. I just heard I am actually going. Got a telegram from Liverpool at 2 p.m. this afternoon, so I've got to go.
Murdoch wrote in a letter dated the 8th of April 1912, the day before Wilde received his telegram from Liverpool.
I'm still chief officer until the day of departure, and it looks like I'm going to have to step down to first officer, so hopefully it won't be too long. If all goes well when Wilde is gone, I will step up again.
This crew document shows the official refurbishment. Murdoch's demotion also meant a reduction in salary, from £25 to £17. According to Elizabeth Gibbons, Murdoch was not in dire need of money, but the loss of £8 raised for a married man with household expenses and a mortgage. It is not a happy event at any time. And it was still particularly undesirable in 1912, in an era of inflation and static wages that would last until the outbreak of the Great War.
Join the group of our channel members. With your help we can bring even more incredible content to you. Join us now and help our channel in this constant evolution. That way you promote this type of content that is scarce on YouTube. Our way to help is the Super Thanks button.
At the end of March 1912, the construction and assembly of Titanic came to an end, and the crew began to assemble for sea trials. Herbert Lydeler was delighted with the new assignment he received in early 1912. He was due to travel to Belfast to accept the post of first officer on the RMS Titanic. Officers Pittman, Boxhall, Lowe and Moody received telegrams from the White Star Line's Superintendent of Navy to report to the company's Liverpool office at 9 o'clock a.m. on the 26th of March to collect their tickets for Belfast and join the Titanic at about 12 hours of the following day, and joining even Chief Officer William Murdoch. Sea trials began on the 2nd of April, on Belfast Lough, and lasted less than a day. After lunch, the main stop test was performed. The Titanic was put on full speed. Sixth Officer Moody and Murdoch carefully observed the position of the marker buoy and the vessel's approach. They relayed their observations to Edward Wilding, who signaled to Captain Smith. At the captain's command, the ship was quickly brought fully astern. The entire vessel began to shudder under the stress of the propellers turning astern at high speed. At a speed of 20 knots, it took Titanic a little less than half a mile to come to a complete stop. In his testimony at the American Inquiry, Lydeler described how impressed he was with the Titanic when he first saw it.
It's difficult to convey any idea of the size of a ship, like the Titanic, when in fact you can walk for miles along decks and walkways, going through different halls the whole time. I was thoroughly familiar with every type of ship afloat, from a battleship to a barge. But it took me 14 days before I could find out with confidence which way was the shortest to whichever place.
Notably, as a first officer, one of his duties involved testing the lifeboats. But during the inquest after the sinking, Lydeler claimed that he lowered only 6 boats into the water and the rest were lowered halfway. According to him, the objective was to test the new davits, and not the boats, as all had already been tested even before being installed on the ship. In addition to testing the lifeboats, First Officer Lydeler saw the watertight doors and they were all in perfect working order. As until then he was First Officer, he was also in charge of checking all ammunition and armament on board. While Titanic was at sea, Third Officer Pittman's duties included making celestial observations, finding compass deviation, supervising deck surroundings, and looking after the quartermasters. Also assist the bridge if necessary. Pittman shared the duty of keeping the logbook with Fifth Officer Lowe and also observing water temperature and time zones during the voyage. Part of Lowe's duty was to examine the lifeboats.
I was instructed by Mr. Murdoch, the then chief officer of the ship. I personally examined the starboard lifeboats and the collapsibles as well.
It was the duty of the chief officer on the White Star Line to be on the forecastle when leaving port. Murdoch held that role until Southampton. The other figure with him would almost undoubtedly be David Blair. Unfairly and incorrectly labeled by the media as the man who sank the Titanic, Davy Blair, a friend of Charles Lydeler, led a life almost as exciting as his friend. It was his appointment as second officer to the Titanic, for which he was best known. However, he was sidelined when Henry Wilde took on William Murdoch as chief officer. He famously took a key from the cupboard, where the watchman's binoculars were kept, as a memento that would later haunt his descendants with accusations that it prevented watchmen from obtaining binoculars, which, on scrutiny, is not true. Still, in the shadow of the strong winds that were the reason for postponing the Titanic's sea trials, the ship finally docked in Belfast. That same day, she received the document that would make it not just a steamship, Titanic, but a Royal Mail ship, Titanic. At 8 p.m., it is taken to Southampton, where it would depart on she maiden voyage 8 days later, on April 10th. With all tests meeting Board of Trade standards, Titanic set sail that same evening at 8 p.m. bound for Southampton, arriving on the 3rd of April. Approaching Southampton on the new Titanic, Vauxhall noticed a change in the weather.
The weather was fine until about 2 a.m. When I walked in for duty at 4 a.m., it was overcast. Skies cleared around 6 a.m.
Once they arrived in Southampton, they had the opportunity to visit the city when they weren't on duty. Perhaps surprising to some, Purser McElroy was arguably the most important person aboard the Titanic. He had to know the entire ship and its crew and have an answer to every question, or at least know who could provide an answer. He was responsible for ensuring that all passengers had valid tickets, did all the shopping for a trip, paid crew salaries, and was the point of contact for all sorts of requests. As on board Olympic, Purser's office was located on the landing on C deck of the grand staircase. He had his own unmarked cabin next to C-53. Hugh McElroy boarded the Titanic the day before sailing -9 April 1912 on a monthly salary of £20.
All alone, I get along just fine with a bottle of whiskey and a cheap box of wine. If I go, maybe this time I'll find a way to get you off my mind. All I need, all I need, all I need, all I need, all I need is a good place to hide, a good place to hide.
Join the group of our channel members. With your help, we can bring even more incredible content to you. Our way to help is the Super Thanks button.
In 1912, 24-year-old James Moody lived with his aunt. During a crossing in 1904, he met Mr. Selby and they became fast friends ever since. In the years that followed working for the White Star Line, Moody always took the time to travel to New York and even London with his friend. This time, Selby wanted Moody to visit Paris with him in March 1912. Moody applied to the White Star Line for permission, but his request was turned down. He was wanted aboard the newest addition to the White Star Line, Titanic. Moody's happiness in having been summoned to the Titanic was remarkable and, like everyone else, this feat would weigh even more on his resume. Moody wrote to his sister Margaret of Belfast about the ship's size.
I've been here a week, mostly busy trying to find my way around the ship. Sometimes I think there might be a train in here. I can't describe any part of a ship that doesn't need 85 clocks and 16 pianos to furnish it. But that's it. I'm learning the best way to get from one end of the ship to the other. And I guarantee it takes a lot of research.
Of his new captain, Edward J. Smith, he noted,
While I believe he is a poor advocate of discipline, he is popular with everyone. He then references Captain Haddock of the Olympic. Daddy Haddock goes to the Olympic until old Edward retires of old age. Until then I stay in this room, which is bigger than a broom closet.
Shortly after the Titanic docked on the night of April 2nd in Southampton, Moody wrote,
Arrived safely at 1:30 a.m. after a beautiful passage from Belfast. Anchored in the moonlight, they started hosting a huge rainbow of flags right over the ship. 220 flags 8 feet each.
On April 5, 1912, the Titanic was photographed decorated with flags for Good Friday in Southampton, England, just as Moody described in his letter. However, the flags were not necessarily a religious observation, but rather used as a salute to the citizens of Southampton. However, she was not open to the public for paid tours as was customary for new ships, such as the Olympic, which had opened the previous year. On April 9th, the day on which Lytler's demotion officially took place, Board of Trade Emigration Officer Maurice Clark boarded the Titanic. He is assisted by Littler and Murdoch for many hours, as he carefully checks that the Titanic meets safety requirements. Littler, when testifying at the North American inquiry, did not hide his displeasure.
Captain Clark, we call him a nuisance because he is so strict. He always wants everything explained to the smallest detail. He insisted that everyone be brought on deck absolutely every time. Life-saving equipment of the ship, life jackets on entire ship. All boats had to be discovered. All breakers examined, oars counted, rudders tested. All davits tried. There was countless detail work. We downloaded all boats. We put them in the water and tied them. Tied them again and hauled them back, and if he wasn't satisfied, he had them all done again. The life jackets in every room, in every compartment, as we say asterisk asterisk anyway, there were vests where all the passengers were.
In the last few hours before the Titanic sailed, the time came when the captain would have to pose for the press. There were about 3 photos, and in all of them, Smith appears very thoughtful. But there was other urgent work to be done. Besides posing for the press, the crew meeting, in which First Officer William Murdoch checked the names of the crew, ended around 9 o'clock a.m. and at 9:30 a.m. the first-class passengers began to arrive. In the same period, a new boat exercise was also carried out for another inspector from the Board of Trade. At 11 o'clock, the pilot from Harvard Boyer arrived and prepared the crew for departure. Once senior officers Wild, Murdoch and Littler had submitted their reports to Smith. First Officer Murdoch reported that the ship had over 2,200 aboard and was ready to sail by noon. Since docking in Southampton, it has been a night and day rush to get everything ready for the Titanic's maiden voyage. On April 10th, because of this, Littler and Murdoch did not have time to change their uniform rank badges before the voyage, causing further confusion among the crew and passengers. On the day of departure, April 10th, when Titanic began her maiden voyage, Littler, now second officer, but still in his first officer uniform, while Murdoch, now first officer, but in his chief officer uniform, according to the robes. The Titanic was with 2 chief officers, Murdoch and Wild. The Titanic was ready to depart at noon for Cherbourg, France. Moody was at the stern gangway door as the Titanic prepared for her midday departure. This is when a late party of several stokers and dressers, who had been drinking in a tavern, arrived, and saw that the last gangway had already been pulled apart. They argued with Moody, who refused them entry on the ship. In one of the most famous photos of the Titanic departing Southampton, the tugs pulling her away from Pier 44, we see the last and most moving photograph of Chief Officer Wild, standing at the bow of the ship, hands seemingly clasped behind his back. As he watches men working on the lines, he is a tall, imposing figure on the world's largest ship embarking on her maiden voyage, working alongside Second Officer Littler in the forecastle. Minutes after this photo, Littler would witness firsthand the powerful effect of these new and large luxury ocean liners. He later wrote in his book,
New York and St. Paul were moored to the dock side by side. They were in a position where the Titanic had to pass very close to them. The terrible suction created in that shallow water just dragged those two big ships.
The moorings broke and the New York came towards us. It was then that Captain Smith's clever maneuver of accelerating the port thruster caused the ship to be pushed away, but it came very close indeed to collision. Once at sea, Moody assumed his position as 6th officer, along with 4th Officer Boxhall. Possibly during this shift, around 4 p.m. Moody placed a mark on the chart with reference to a first received ice message. 3rd Officer Pittman later testified at the British inquest.
As I recall, an ice warning was placed on the chart between 4 and p.m. Mr. Boxhall doesn't seem to have any recollection of it, so it must have been Mr. Moody. I saw it there myself when I got to the deck at 6 p.m.
On the bridge, the absence of the key to the cabinet where the binoculars were kept is felt by the officers. Lytler later reported to the American report.
I was in my room and I heard a voice speaking in the chambers. I recognized it to be the voice of Simmons, the watchman, so I went out the door. I saw him and said, "What is it, Simmons?" Then he said, "We don't have surveillance glasses in the crow's nest." I said, "Okay." I entered the boss's room and repeated to him that there were no watch glasses for the crow's nest. I don't remember his actual answer, but it was in the sense that he knew about it, that he was knowledgeable about it. He replied that there were no glasses for the watchman, so I said to Simmons, "No glasses for you." With that, he left.
Although the near collision delayed departure for about an hour, while the drifting New York was brought under control, Titanic arrived 4 hours later at 6:35 p.m. in the French port of Cherbourg to pick up more passengers. Due to the size of the Titanic and the lack of adequate docking facilities in Cherbourg, the White Star Line operated two ferries, the SS Traffic and the SS Nomadic. Aboard the Traffic, a curious little incident occurred. Commander Leloup, a member of the French Navy, wanted to pay a visit on the Titanic. The moment he went to cross the boarding gangway, Murdoch barred Leloup, who asked, "I want to know why a French naval officer is prevented from boarding a foreign merchant ship." In the port of Cherbourg, indeed, Lieutenant Murdoch disobeyed an important maritime regulation by prohibiting a French officer from accessing the ship. George William Bowyer was a pilot aboard the Titanic and landed in Cherbourg. George William is a little remembered figure in Titanic history, likely for his short time aboard the ship. The year before, he had been on the bridge alongside Smith when the Olympic collided with the cruiser HMS Hawke. Bowyer appeared before the court and was questioned on several points. Although he agreed that these new vessels were getting too big, he, along with the Royal Navy, were blamed for the incident. On the Titanic, technically speaking, Bowyer was in charge of getting the ship to Cherbourg. In that short period of a few hours, he was responsible for some rare records aboard the Titanic. In every photograph he took, he annotated his hand, details supporting the photo in his own fist. Finally, at 8:10 p.m., the Titanic departed Cherbourg bound for Queenstown, arriving at 11:30 a.m. on Thursday, April 11th. In Cork Harbour on the south coast of Ireland, again, the docks were not large enough for a ship the size of the Titanic and ferries were used. During the Titanic stopover in Queenstown, Ireland, Lowe took the opportunity to send a special gift to his fiancée, Ellen Whitehouse. He had asked for a Titanic first meal menu, as she was interested in seeing the fine dining options that were available on board. At the bottom, Lowe had scribbled, "This is the first meal served on board." The menu, dated April 2nd, 1912, offered options for consomme mirette, sweetbreads, spring lamb and braised ham. Ellen treasured the gift as a beautiful keepsake, and many years later, in 2004, the small menu sold at auction for over £40,000. As was customary, there was a daily inspection of the ship by Captain Smith, Purser McAlory, and some of the deck officers at 10:30 a.m. to ensure that all was in order on the ship. It was after this 9-mile ride inside the ship that an iconic photograph of McElroy and Smith was taken by photographer Thomas Barker. The window to McElroy's left is the fourth officer's cabin in Boxhall, while the next 4 windows belong to the captain's quarters. This is the last recorded photo of Edward Smith, after 113 passengers have boarded and 7 have disembarked. Murdoch and Lidler are seen preparing to close the walkway before departing Queenstown. This is the last photo of First Officer Murdoch on record. Smith also had his own private butler, 29-year-old James Payton, to bring his meals or messages. Payton had worked with Smith on the Olympic and was already very familiar with the captain. While the Titanic was docked near Queenstown, Payton wrote an intriguing letter to his parents in Oxford.
Wow, what a beautiful ship this is. Much better than the Olympic as far as passengers are concerned, but my little room is not so pretty. No daylight, the lamp is on all day, but I don't think there's any point in grumbling. I had enough time to visit you, and ended up not realizing that the days passed so quickly. I think Olympics bad luck seems to have caught up with us.
Can you believe that when we left the Southampton docks this morning, we passed very close to the SS New York, and it almost hit us? There was quite a stir for a while, but I don't think anything bad happened, except 1 or 2 people knocked down by the ropes that fell into the water.
It is interesting to note the use of Payton when he writes about the bad luck Olympic had in incidents while Smith was in charge. The collision with the port of Olympic's maiden voyage, the loss of a propeller blade on a sandbar, then the collision with the Hawk, and now the Titanic was in a similar situation on her first voyage. But what Payton didn't expect is that nothing could prepare him for what was to come. Titanic weighed anchor for the last time at 1:30 p.m. and departed Queenstown on her westward journey across the Atlantic. There was nothing in front of the Titanic and her more than 2,200 passengers on board but the ocean.
I don't know if I'm strong enough. I've never been the kind to give it up, but this time I don't know which way to go. Somewhere I've already been. Am I really going back again this time?